welcome to another episode of Colorado Politicking. I'm your host, Pat Poblete, and we are coming to you just hours after Colorado's 2022 legislative session came to a close. And we're going to do a wrap-up of the entire session, kind of bringing in a lot of different reporters who report on different aspects of this coming to you next week. But this week, we're going to be hyper-focused on the end of session crunch. And to kick things off, I want to bring in Chief Legislative Reporter Marianne Goodland. Now, Marianne, for those who may not be super familiar with the legislative process here in Colorado, why is it that there's this end of session crunch and lawmakers were under a lot of pressure to get stuff done?
It's not unusual, no matter which party is in control, to see some of the most significant and also the most controversial bills coming in the second half of the session. This year, however, we had a sort of a perfect storm of a lot of very controversial bills, whether it was fentanyl, recycling, collective bargaining, a juvenile crime bill that actually failed on its final day. Lots of really major significant bills that wound up in lawmakers' laps in the last 30 days. And that gave Republicans an opportunity that they used to their advantage as much as the minority possibly can, which was to stymie as much of the Democrats' agenda, and in some cases with hundreds and hundreds of amendments on bills, even on bills that they liked and that they wanted to support, in order to get Democrats to the negotiating table to decide what do you want to see passed, and can we talk about amending the things that you want to stick to. So, and I watched the numbers for where the legislature was headed over about the last 10 days. And frankly, it was pretty shocking. And there were people who complained that the political pundit class raises this issue every year, but this year really was unusually high. 657 bills were introduced in the 2022 session. 10 days before the session was over with, more than half still had not made it to the final stage. That was just shocking and made a lot of people very nervous. And that number did not get whittled down really until next to the last day of session, when they finally got down to about 200. And then on the last day of the session, they still had 100 bills, and most of this backlog was in the House, and that's due to the obstructions by the Republicans, who were looking to craft deals on some of these big issues. So that's why this session wound up being a lot of very, very late hours. And I'm going to say one other thing: the majority leader of the House and the majority leader of the Senate both made decisions about time management that may not have been as well thought out. Last year, we did wind up seeing lawmakers working on the weekends. This year, the only day that they wound up coming in on a weekend was on a 24-hour debate on abortion back in March. So the decisions by the and this was definitely more a problem in the House than it was the Senate. The decision by the majority leader not to work on weekends led to a lot of these very, very late hours through the last 10 days of the session.
So, Marianne, that does a good job of kind of setting the stage as to why there was this time crunch and just how much lawmakers had to consider at the end there. But I want to go into specifics, and we'll kick it back to you, Marianne, and we'll bring in legislative reporter Hannah Metzger here as well. But let's talk about legislation itself. With this logjam, what passed and what didn't? Marianne, we'll start with you. What kind of got through in the face of these filibusters, in the face of this last-minute calendar logjam?
The biggest bills of the session wound up. Most of the biggest bills of the session wound up being the very last things that lawmakers dealt with. That was a bill on collective bargaining for counties. And that bill wound up with 580 amendments drafted for it between the House and Senate, and wound up getting watered down to pretty much nothing. County workers have no more authority to collective bargain than they did before this law was introduced. Fentanyl, absolutely the number one most controversial bill of the session went down to 11:45 in the House. A huge fight over a compromise that the sponsors crafted, and in fact was so disappointing to Republicans that the Republican sponsor in the House took his name off the bill. That went down to the wire. We also had the School Finance Act went down to the wire too, which is kind of unusual. That one usually gets done relatively quickly and easily, but it had a very odd amendment put on it at the last minute. And that wound up being the very last bill that got voted on in the 2022 session.
Now, for the flip side of the coin, let's bring in reporter Hannah Metzger. And Hannah, congratulations on not only surviving, but thriving all the way through your first legislative session. But let's talk about what didn't make it through. So we heard Marianne set up the crunch. We heard Marianne talk about what eventually legislators were able to pass through. What got left on the sidelines as this last minute time crunch happened?
Right. Well, multiple high-profile bills were killed in the last 48 hours of the session, including the flavored tobacco ban, outlawing talking on the phone while driving, and prohibiting police from lying to minors during interrogations. The very last bill that they actually considered this session was the measure to prohibit police from lying to minors. The House sponsors in the end chose to kill the bill with less than an hour left before the midnight deadline. The bill's death came after the House rewrote it earlier in the day, but then the Senate voted down the changes and asked them to consider it as written. The rewrite seriously weakened the bill, replacing the prohibition with a requirement that police adopt written policies for interrogating juveniles instead. But the sponsor said they're going to try to bring the original version of the bill back next year.
Well, thank you, Hannah, and thank you both for the late nights you spent at the Capitol over the course of the last 120 days. We really appreciate your hard work. I know the Colorado general public does as well, because you guys have done a top-notch job really keeping track of what's going on in that building. So from me and from all of the people in the Colorado, thank you so much. As for our audience, we will see you again next week for a live and in-person recording of this. You'll see a couple of more of my friends along here with me. But until then, I've been Pat. For Marianne and Hannah, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you again next week.